So I'm going to be talking about Christ consciousness and language. So firstly, I want to just look at the notion of the evolution of language. And as I said yesterday, Homo sapiens came on the scene about 200,000 years ago. And Homo sapiens means literally wise, the wise ones. So they could think rationally. There was a kind of a prefrontal left cortex, so they could think, but they couldn't think about thinking. And so that's the essence of language. Language is the ability to manipulate symbols intracranially. So we didn't have that ability 200,000 years ago. That only arrived about 70,000 years ago with an upgrade that's called Homo sapiens sapiens. So they're kind of the wise ones. And then, now language became possible. And this was an amazing thing because now for the first time ever, you could transfer a map of your own reality to somebody else. You could communicate to them what was happening inside in your own psyche. So that was a huge breakthrough with language 70,000 years ago. And then the next breakthrough was, how do you kind of record that, not just vocally, but kind of visually? How do you write that kind of stuff down? Now, you can kind of draw pictures of it, but how can you create a written form of language? And the two first civilizations to come up with that were the Sumerians, who developed what's called cuneiform, and the Egyptians, who developed hieroglyphics. And now for the first time ever, we could communicate our maps not just through auditory communication, but through some kind of a visual format. We could record it in an art form or with words. Now the problem at this stage was both hieroglyphics and cuneiform had thousands of symbols. So how do you represent, everything that's in your mind symbolically in some kind of a written format? Because you can think about, okay, I can kind of write down what an elephant means to me or what a table means to me, but how do I write down something like fidelity or trust or fear or anxiety? How in God's name do you find the kind of written versions of that? So it became really, really complex. How in a written format you can communicate all of these experiences that the brain is having. So there had to be thousands of symbols, which made cuneiform and hieroglyphics really, really complex systems. And only very, very highly educated scribes, were capable of doing that. And then about the year 1500 BCE, an extraordinary group of people called the Phoenicians, they came up with an extraordinary simple writing system. They were able to break down all the sounds in their language to 22 phonemes. Just 22 basic sounds that can be represented alphabetically. And so a phoneme is actually even shorter than a syllable. We think that a syllable is the shortest kind of grunt that a human being can make. But syllables are composed of phonemes. So if I say the word, for instance, up, look up, the word up, which is a single syllable, is actually two phonemes. It's a up, is a U sound and a P sound. And you put a up sound and a P sound together and you get up. So you're breaking syllables down into kind of phonemes. And so a phoneme is the shortest sound that the human kind of vocal cords can make. And they realized that in their language, at least, there were only 22 basic phonemes. And so now they could reduce the extraordinary complexity of cuneiform, and hieroglyphics into just 22 symbols. And so they gave us literally this brilliant, simplistic way of recording language. Now, the beauty of it was that it could be immediately taken up by any other language group. So the Greeks took it up, and the Romans took it up, and the Hebrews took it up, and some other languages had a few more phonemes. So in English, we have 26 phonemes. Gaelic, we only have 20. There are only 20 phonemes in Gaelic. There are 26 in English. And obviously languages like in South Africa, the click languages, they've got some extra phonemes. But basically, you can reduce all human languages to less than 30 phonemes, which means then that you can represent it in a written language form really, really simply. And that gave birth to the first kind of alphabet, where you can have just specific symbols, and reduce the complexity of cuneiform and hieroglyphics just to about 20 to 26 kind of basic symbols. So that was the first effort then at simplifying written language. Now, language has many, many other uses then. So for instance, in Sanskrit, in the language of Sanskrit, I think if I remember correctly, there's like about 20 consonants and about 53 vowel signs. And so for Sanskrit, they believe that sounds actually create reality. So they believe that when you speak Sanskrit, you're actually calling reality into being. You're not just talking about a pre-existing reality, that it is the sounds themselves that actually create the reality. And the Aborigines of Australia had the same notion. When they talk about dream time, that the ancestors sang reality into being. There's the sounds they made that brought reality into being. And so it became really important for the Aborigines in Australia that in order to traverse any terrain, you needed to know the music of the terrain. You had to be in harmony with the music of the environment in which you are now finding yourself. So you would never think about, crossing a river or climbing a mountain among the Aboriginals unless you knew the music of the mountain and the music of the stream, so that you came into harmony with it. And you get the very same notion in Christianity. We call it the Logos. So the Logos is literally the sound of creation. So when we talk about Jesus as the Word of God, it's not so much a written word like the Bible or the scriptures, it's the sound. And in Sanskrit, you have the notion of Om, that Om is what brings reality into being. So language then has so many different facets to it, that they're literally the acoustical vibrations that you create through the larynx, in some senses, are causing us to be in harmony with reality or even to create reality. So that's the first section I want to talk about. Section 2, I want to mention a guy called Ferdinand de Saussure. Ferdinand de Saussure was a Swiss linguist. I believe he was the greatest linguist of the 20th century. He flourished between 1857 and 1913. And when he was talking about oral language, he broke it up into 3 parts. He called one part the referent, the second part the signified, and the third part the signifiers. And so the referent is what's in the outside world. So if I'm kind of walking in the bush in East Africa and I come across a pachyderm with 2 huge long big tusks and a long tail and it weighs 1.5 tons, that's the reference, that's the object in the real world I'm looking at. But then I create a multi-sensory image in my mind. And so I hear him making a sound and I see him and maybe I can smell him. And so I've got this multi-sensory image in my head. And the Saussure would call that is the signified. That's how I've signified the referent in the real world. And then I'm going to kind of communicate it to Kim. And if we're speaking in English, I'm going to call it an elephant. If we're speaking in Swahili, I'm going to call it ndovu. If I'm speaking in Kalenjin, I'm going to call it Beliot. And so the signifiers are different for the same signified. Depending on the language group that I'm working with, there are going to be different signifiers for the same signified. Now, the problems with this are the following. There is absolutely no guarantee that the signified in my head actually corresponds to the referent in the real world. And we know this from quantum mechanics, because there isn't an elephant out there. There are electromagnetic waves that the brain is translating into images that I'm going to call an elephant or a ndovu. And so the question is, the ultimate reality is not the referent in the world out there. There's not an elephant out there. There are electromagnetic waves that the brain is inferring or translating as elephant. So the big problem with the referent is, I don't know if the referent is the ultimate reality. And therefore, I have no guarantee that the signified, the multi-sensory image I've created in my own mind, bears any resemblance to what's actually out there. And this is called, in philosophy, it's called the myth of the given. The myth of the given is kind of the illusion or the wrongful inference that my mental image actually corresponds with the reality outside of my sensorium. So that's the first big problem we have. So we're literally translating electromagnetic signals into some kind of reference and into some kind of signifieds in the hand. And then the signifiers, the words I'm using, I have no guarantee that you understand by the word I'm using what I think I mean by the word I'm using. So any word I use, if I talk about, a laptop, I have no guarantee that you understand by laptop what I'm trying to give you when I say the word laptop. You may have a totally different notion of what laptop is about. Laptop could be about dancing, you know, or about a computer. I have no idea what you hear when I say a laptop. So at every stage, we don't know if the referent is real, we don't know if the signified is real, and we don't know if the signifiers are real. So here's the problem. So I had an image years and years and years ago. It was the following. Imagine you and all of humanity has lived your entire lifetimes inside this huge, huge, big shed, big concrete shed. There are no windows in it and there are no doors in it. But there's a machine on the wall, a lever, and if you pull the lever, it dispenses mincemeat into the room. And that's how you feed yourself. But nobody in the room has ever been outside the room. They have no idea what's outside the room. So there's only this lever, and you pull the lever and you get mincemeat in the room. So the inference is going to be that the outside is a place filled with mincemeat. And when you pull the lever, it dispenses a bunch of mincemeat into the room. But in actual fact, outside is a farmer with cows and pastures, and he grazes the cows, and there's a big meat grinder outside, and every so often he brings a cow up and he minces the cow. And when you pull the lever, you get mincemeat inside in the room. But you're believing that the outside is just mincemeat. But it's not. It's cows and pastures, and so that's the problem we have. We live inside in this huge big room, and there's a mincemeat dispenser in it, and we pull the lever and we get the mincemeat. We say, oh, this is reality. And therefore, outside of the room is more mincemeat. That's the problem we have with the myth of the given. We've no guarantee that what our sensorium delivers to us bears any resemblance to what's actually out there. And this then becomes the importance of transcending language. You know, I'm going into altered states of consciousness in order to manage to get outside the room in which we're trapped. So section 3, then I wanted to talk about my own theory of the story of the Tower of Babel. According to the Bible, originally human beings spoke a single language. And then they got beyond themselves and they started trying to create a tower that could reach the heavens. Now, in actual fact, it was probably some kind of a spacecraft, because they were encountering extraterrestrial entities that they called gods, who came down, you know, and they lived in the skies. And now we're trying to get up to where they live. So we're creating some kind of technology to get to encounter them. And so the image that's been given by, you know, agrarian people is some kind of a tower that reaches the heavens. But I think actually it may have been a technology of some kind of spacecraft that they were attempting to create. And the gods, the sky beings, didn't want us in their backyard. And so they came down, and allegedly we only spoke one language, so they decided to confuse us. And eventually we're now speaking 7,000 different languages. Now, I have a theory that it's not so much that they confused our languages as much as that we were telepathic beings before language arrived. We communicated telepathically with each other, and in order to confuse us, they introduced language into the equation. And when you learn to speak, you rely less and less and less on telepathy. In the very same way, when I was in school, every kid had to be able to do arithmetic and calculations, and we had to learn how to spell. Now we've got the calculators, and we've got spell checks, and nobody knows how to calculate anymore or how to spell properly, because your machine is going to do it for you. So we lose, if we don't use it, we're going to lose it. So eventually our telepathic abilities began to recede, because now we had language to communicate. And so eventually we lost the ability to be telepathic. Some people obviously still have it. And animals still have it in a way that we don't. So your cat and your dog has an ability to read signals, you know, that you can't read. My theory is that Babel was not about the confusion of languages rather than the introduction of language. And it's interesting that the Hebrew word Babel in Hebrew means confusion. But actually, in the Akkadian language, it means the gate of God, Babel. El is God, and Babel is the gate to God. And it's the same word from Babylon, the word Babylon. Bab is the word for a gateway. So Babylon is the gateway to the gods. That's what the term actually means in the ancient Akkadian language. So in some senses then, spoken language was a retrograde step. It disconnected us from our telepathic abilities. That's my theory. Now, even when we use spoken language then, it's really, really leaky. It's a really leaky vessel. If I ask you to take 5 seconds right now, I'm going to remain silent, look around this room, just scan this entire room for 5 seconds. I guarantee you, you've picked up more information than you could articulate in the next 5 years. everything that you've registered in that 5 seconds, there is so much data and so much information that if you were to try to explain it, everything from the curtains to the sounds, to the lights, to the windows, to the people, to the floorboards, if you were to articulate all of that, it would take you 5 years actually to express what you've grokked in 5 seconds. So that's the problem with written language. It's a totally inadequate vessel to communicate, even what our sensory apparatus is delivering to us. So how about then if we could somehow kind of reconnect with our telepathic abilities? Because with telepathy, I can transfer a whole bunch of ideas from my head into your head without ever using language. And so I have bypassed the signifiers. I don't have to use spoken words anymore. I can download the contents of my mind into your mind. So that would be telepathy. Now, and what I'm doing then is I'm now downloading the signifieds in my head. I still am not downloading the reference, because what I'm doing is I have these images, these multi-sensory images in my head that I'm going to call the signified, and now I'm going to download that into your head. So what I'm doing is I'm downloading my signifieds into your head. But I've no guarantee that I'm actually downloading the reference in your head, because the reference and the signifieds in my head, there may be a totally disconnect between the two. So that's the problem, even with telepathy. I'm just sending you my signifieds. I'm not sending you the reference themselves. So what if there's a higher form of telepathy where you can actually transfer the reference from one's mind to the other? Now, so this for me would be a higher dimensional form of communication. And that for me is that's the connection to a kind of a Christ consciousness. That it is telepathy of a totally different order, where I'm literally able to download the reference themselves from one mind to the other. And I think this is what happens actually if you study near-death experience literature, when they keep telling us, I can't describe to you what my experience was actually like. The colors were totally different. The sounds were totally different. The sense of love was completely different. But there are not any human words to communicate this. So for me, it's that, they've had an experience which cannot be downloaded even telepathically, and certainly not in spoken language. I think, for instance, as we encounter extraterrestrial entities, that they're using a language, which is so beyond ours that our reference and our signifieds and our signifiers cannot communicate to you what they're trying to communicate themselves. And I think, in fact, that angelic language may be this level of telepathy, the ability to transfer the reference themselves from one person to the other. So that's what I mean then when I talk about levels of telepathy. This brings me to section 5 then, reality making. So given this little kind of laptop that we carry between our ears right now, here's the process we typically go through as human beings. The first thing is we soak in data. We collapse the electromagnetic spectrum into kind of data that the sensorium can grok. So that's the first step, is kind of downloading the data from the wavelength. Then the brain begins to process this, so it's turning data into information. And as I said the first day, for me there's a big difference between information and data. Data is an alphabet. A, B, C, D, E. Information is what I can use the alphabet to construct. I can give you 4 or 5 letters. I give you the letters E, I, L, and V, which are just data points. But now you can create information depending on how you arrange these 4 letters. You can spell it as L-I-V-E, which is live. I could spell it as E-V-I-L, which is evil. Or you could spell it as V-I-L-E, which is vile. So you're taking the same data points, but you're reconfiguring them in order to create information from them. And I give you the example from mathematics. If I give you a bunch of letters like A, B, C, and X, and I give you some mathematical symbols like plus and minus and square root of, I'm just giving you data points. But if I organize them and I say X is equal to minus B plus or minus the square root of B squared minus 4AC over 2A, I've given you the solution to a quadratic equation. And so there's a big difference then between data and information. So we start with data through the sensorium, then we process the data, we create information, and then the information creates an experience. I think here's what really happened, here's what happened, the experience I had. Then I store those experiences and I create a memory bank for future use. And then my model of reality is constructed from my memory bank. I go into my memory and then I create a model of reality. And then I realize that my model of reality is maybe different, from Chris's model of reality. So we compare our models of reality, and then you get a whole bunch of people together, and we do a kind of set theory. The intersection set of all our personal realities now becomes the consensual reality of the culture. And then we're locked in. So imagine set theory with a whole bunch of overlapping circles, and there's the intersection in the very middle where they're all connected. And that then becomes our consensual reality. And thereafter, it becomes almost impossible to experience anything that the culture says is not real. If you step outside the culturally accepted reality, then you're crazy. You're either a prophet or you're schizophrenic. And so now we've kind of shrunken down reality to what the group can agree upon. And when you get to a kind of a global reality and the intersection of all these different cultural sets, we've totally shrunken reality down to this tiny little slice that we call materialism. And that's our problem right now, that we're struggling with a vesica, an overlapping system of sets which have reduced ultimate reality, Christ consciousness, down to what our sensorium can deliver to us. So that's our reality making. That's the problem that we experience right now. Now, colonialism then swaps out one reality for another reality. And there are many, many different forms of colonialism. There's military conquest. Education can be a form of colonialism. Entertainment can be a form of colonialism. Financial situations, institutions can be a form of colonialism. Science can be a form of colonialism. Religion can be a form of colonialism. Medicine, pharma, the WEF, the United Nations, the CDC, the FDA, they're all colonialists who are trying to kind of shrink ultimate reality down to this tiny little perspective. And our job is to break out of that mindset into a Christ consciousness. So the twin attacks then of any form of colonialism are censorship of one perspective and propagandizing of a second perspective. And that's the situation in which we find ourselves right now. We're battling between a censorship and a propaganda that is attempting to shrink all of reality down to a particular perspective and not allow other perspectives to enter the equation. And that is the kind of birthing process of Christ consciousness in our times. And that's why you and I are here today. And not just this little group in Healdsburg, but on planet Earth right now, that we volunteered to be here now, to become light workers for this process, to bust this myth of consensual reality, and to enter altered states of consciousness that allow us to develop Christ consciousness and see what really, really is. Which brings me to section 6 then, mysticism. So with ordinary language then, as de Saussure said, you have the reference in the real world, allegedly. You have the signified, the multi-sensory image in your head, and then the signifiers, the words that you're going to use to express your mindset. So then, telepathy then, strictly speaking, has reference and signifies, but it doesn't have signifiers. If I'm using telepathy, I don't need signifiers, but I'm still using signifieds and reference. Mysticism has reference, but it neither has signifieds nor signifiers. So when I'm in a mystical state, I still have reference, but I don't have signifieds anymore in my brain, and I don't have signifiers anymore in my mouth. Because in mysticism, we're in conversation with Source itself. And so when you transcend mysticism and you get to unity consciousness, then there are no reference, there are no signifieds, and there are no signifiers. It's God's internal dialogue. So there are no reference, there are no signifieds, and there are no signifiers. And then full enlightenment is the kind of the permanent identification with Source. And for me, that's just another word for Christ consciousness. And that's the objective of the exercise. Section 7, then I talk about a ritual. So when I try to analyze it for myself, the conclusion I've come to is that vocalizations are the language of animals. All the animals make particular kinds of vocalizations, and that's their language system. Words are the language of humans, and rituals are the language of communities, and silence is the language of the mystics. So I look at 4 different levels of language. That vocalizations are the language of animals, words are the language of humans, rituals are the language of communities, and silence is the language of the mystics. Now, let me focus on rituals for a few moments. So rituals typically are kind of multi-sensory, multi-modality expressions of an entire community. So something as kind of secular as a ball game. You go to a Super Bowl, and it's a whole ritual attendant to it. There's a tailgate party outside the stadium. There are the chants that you make up on behalf of your team. There's the uniforms that the different teams are using. There are the rules of the game. There's hot dogs and there's beers. So there's a whole ritual attendant upon, a ball game. So we don't realize that even in secular society, ritual is hugely important to us. Now, when we get to kind of sacred liturgy, it's the same notion. It's a multi-sensory modality, a multi-sensory and a multi-dimensional kind of expression of the community. And so, for instance, let's take a high mass in the kind of the Catholic system. So what do you have? You have a liturgy which is appealing to the entire sensorium. You have visuals, the vestments, the color of the vestments that the priest is wearing, and it'll be different for each season. You have stained glass windows. You have the architecture of the building. You've got statuary. So it's appealing visually to you during the liturgy. Then you've got an olfactory element. There's incense. Somebody is waving a thurifer, and there's the incense olfactory. Then there's movement, particular body movements. So you're joining your hands, or you're bowing, or you're genuflecting, or the priest is saying, Dominus vobiscum. So there's all these physical gestures that are part of it. There's the taste buds, not very well done actually. The bread and the wine is basically stale bread and kind of bad wine, but at least there's some kind of a gustatory element to it. And then there's touch. You're hugging, or you're making the sign of peace, or whatever. And so, a good liturgy, Jen, is trying to engage kind of all of the sensorium. So then I say that ritual then is a kind of is the language of a community. Now, the same thing is true then of, I like to differentiate between signs, symbols, and sacraments. So signs are one physical reality standing for another physical reality. So when you're driving, you come across a road sign. It's a piece of metal with paint on it telling you that in another 100 meters, there'll be a road to your left. So as one physical reality, the piece of metal standing for another physical reality, the roadway coming up. So that's what a sign does. A symbol has one foot in physicality and the other foot in the metaphysical. So a hug or a kiss is not just a sign, it's a symbol. Because one leg is in physical reality, I'm hugging you with my two arms, but metaphysically, I'm telling you, I love you. And so now it has one foot in the metaphysical and one foot in the physical. And that means it's a symbol rather than just a mere sign. And then you have sacraments. And sacraments are different because sacraments actualize that which they symbolize. So a sacrament makes something totally real from the mere symbol. And so if you come up for communion and I take the host, and let's say the example I use, it's communion time. And this is going back 30 years. And there's a line of people coming up for communion. And one person comes up really devoutly, joins her hands, sticks her tongue out, and I put the host and I say, Corpus Christi, the body of Christ. Now, for that person, in an altered state of consciousness, she's having communion with Jesus in an altered state of Jesus, a higher state of Jesus consciousness. So there's a real communion happening, which is why we call it communion. Now, after that comes a little kid. He's 10 years old. He's got a wad of chewing gum in his mouth, and he's chewing furiously, and he's spit out his tongue. And I say, Corpus Christi, and I put a piece of stale bread on his tongue. And now you got a piece of stale bread and a piece of chewing gum wrestling for a piece of real estate. Was that a real encounter with Jesus? Absolutely not. The kid went back to his seat with a piece of stale bread and a piece of chewing gum. That's all that happened. Because there was no elevation of consciousness, and Jesus says, there's no way I'm going to share space with a piece of chewing gum. I'm not taking this one. So that the sacrament then is, what do you do with your state of consciousness in order to encounter reality at a different level of itself? So that's what I mean then by a sacrament. A sacrament is that which actualizes that which it symbolizes. Now, the thing about a sign is that a sign can be made to tell lies. I can go down to a signpost and twist it 90 degrees, and you drive down, and you're looking to go, and you're looking for a signpost, you're going to go right instead of left, and you're going to go wrong. So a sign can be made to tell lies. Even a symbol can be made to tell lies. Judas betrayed Jesus with a kiss. The symbol of the kiss was, I love you, I'm devoted to you, and it was a sign to the soldiers, this is the guy, arrest him. And so a symbol can be made to lie, but a sacrament can never lie, because a sacrament is contingent upon the mindset of the recipient, and the presence of the real Jesus Christ. So there's this big difference between the three. So section number 8, I call it parables, proverbs, and stories. So many, many years ago, I have a real passion for inventing words. So I invented a word that I call mythish. And mythish is mystical teaching in story form. That's what I mean by it. Mythish is mystical teaching in story form. And so mythish for me is a sacred, secret language in which the true wisdom of a culture is archived and transmitted. So when I think about mythology and mythish, they are really sacred languages in which the true wisdom of a culture is archived and is transmitted. And I call that language mythish. And of course, modern humans totally misunderstood. They think mythish is just gibberish. It's a mythology. It's a kind of pre-scientific thinking. And it is pre-scientific only in the sense that it's not dependent upon the sensorium. It's pre-scientific in the sense that it's appealing to the soul self rather than to the kind of the sensorium self. So tying spiritual teachings to dictionary-defined language or philosophical concepts or theological theories or scientific terminology is a doomed exercise. If we try to tie ultimate reality to any of these modalities, it's a doomed exercise. The image that comes to me when I think about this is like putting all your food into a fridge that's not plugged in. You think you're kind of saving your food by putting it into the refrigerator, but the fridge isn't plugged in at the back. So all the food is going to spoil. And so when we try to archive our wisdom, either in philosophical concepts, theological theories, scientific terminology, it's putting food into a fridge that's not plugged in. It's going to spoil. It'll always spoil. So you need a different kind of a fridge. You need the fridge of mythology or mythish in order to understand this. So in order to understand, Christ consciousness, you need to learn how to speak mythish. And the final thing, section 9, very briefly, name calling. I've mentioned this a few days ago as well. Naming something is not about hanging an identity tag on a cow's ear, or putting a collar on a cat. That's not name calling. When Adam and Eve were invited by God to name the animals in the Garden of Eden, God was asking them to kind of align with the essence of the other being, so that you were identifying with their essence, not just hanging a name tag upon them. And that's the reason then that when you do that, it gives you're in a power position with that which you've named. If you know the name and the essence of another, it gives you an element of control over it, which can be abused, which is why God refused to divulge his name. When Moses says to God at the burning bush, what is your name? When the people said to you, what God are you talking about? How will I identify you? And God says in Hebrew, Ehiyah, Ashir, Ehiyah, which is a future tense. He did not say, I am who I am. As I said to you, there is no present tense of the verb to be in the Hebrew language. You have to get around it by a technique called predication without a verb. And we had the same issue in Kalenjin. And so what God actually said was, Ehiyah, Ashir, Ehiyah, I will be who I will be. In other words, God is saying, I will show up in whatever way I choose to show up. And so God refuses to divulge a static kind of a version of himself. So when you know somebody's real name, then you're in service, in contact with its essence. So one of the most beautiful passages in all the scriptures for me is John chapter 20, where Jesus has risen from the dead. Mary of Magdala comes to the tomb is empty, and she's freaking out. And she looks in, the tomb is empty, and then there's a figure behind her. She looks around, she's been crying copiously, the sun is in her eyes, and there's this figure standing there, and this figure says to her, woman, why are you weeping? And she looks around and she doesn't recognize him. She thinks he's the gardener. She says, sir, if you've taken the body, can you tell me where you've laid him? I'll go and take him back. And Jesus called her name. And he didn't call her Miriamu. He spoke her secret, sacred name. And then Mary recognized him. And that's the whole point of John chapter 20 for me. He didn't say Miriam. He spoke her secret, sacred name. And then Mary recognized him. And so the Magdalene, who had been Christ attracted for the last 3 years, had now become Christ conscious. And now we have this woman becoming the apostolorum, the apostle to the apostles. And so that's the invitation for us, to try to figure out what your true name is. What was the name that grandmother God gave you when you were winging your way into incarnation? Because then you'll understand who you are and why you've come. Namaste, my brothers and sisters. Kim's question then is about the importance of languages, and the question is basically about speaking in tongues. You know, Pentecostal churches particularly have this notion of speaking in tongues, and it goes back to the reason it's called Pentecostal. It goes back to the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 2, where the Spirit descends upon the apostles. And it's interesting that the apostles are gathered, you know, under the auspices of Mary, the mother of Jesus, and I believe of Mary of Magdala. They are the ones who are holding the community together after Jesus had died. They have no idea what's happened. He's ascended back to the heavens. And what are we going to do now? He's gone. But Mary holds them together. The two Marys hold them together, you know. And then there's the Pentecostal experience, and suddenly they begin speaking in all the known languages. There are people in Jerusalem for a big Jewish feast from all over the kind of diaspora. The Jews scattered all over the world, and they're coming back, and they said, who are these men and women speaking? You know, we're Medes and Persians, and, you know, from all parts of the world, and every one of us hears them speaking in our own language. And so it's not that Peter and the apostles were using different languages, but that somehow the people were understanding what was being uttered. That Peter and the apostles weren't speaking a human language in a sense. They were at a totally different level of communication. They were at the level of logos. And logos allowed the listeners to understand in their own languages. And so the miracle of Pentecost was not so much that they spoke in different tongues, but that the different communities were able to infer meaning from whatever extraordinary logos or sounds were happening, higher order sounds. So the Pentecostal movement then took that up as a notion that there are higher levels of language. And I remember I spent 3 months in Tanzania. I lived in Tanzania between September of 1973 and December 1973. I was learning Swahili. And so I was in a college. It was a seminary, and a language school attended to it. And there was a Pentecostal group in the seminary, a Catholic charismatic movement in the seminary. And so I attended the meetings, and spontaneously I found myself speaking in tongues, a language I didn't understand. I came back to Ireland for my first vacation in 1975, and I attended a Catholic charismatic conference in Dublin. There were 5,000 people present at the RDS in Dublin in a huge big auditorium. And all of a sudden, somebody started singing in tongues. And the whole congregation, 5,000 of us, took it up. And it continued, I would say, for 7 minutes. There's nobody directing it. There's no music in attendance. There was just this extraordinary 5,000 different voices singing in different languages, you know, and it kind of crested and it waved and there was a harmony to it, and then it tailed off and it stopped. Almost as if you were a conductor, you know, saying, okay, this is it. It's the only time it's ever happened to me. And I will never forget it. One of the most extraordinary spiritual experiences. It was totally without a conductor. There was no signal. The languages were totally different. The music was totally different. But it was the greatest form of harmony I've ever experienced in my entire lifetime. And so for me, singing in tongues then is that accessing a different level of language, which transcends kind of referent, you know, signified and signifiers. So yes, I do believe in the phenomenon of kind of speaking in tongues, but it's not kind of, I moved from Swahili to Kalenjin to English to Irish. It's a totally different phenomenon. Yeah. The question has to do with people who go missing in the national parks. It's a whole phenomenon. So what's happening is that there's shrunken reality. And you're talking about the work of David Paulides, yes? Yeah, missing 411. Yes, okay. So it's the realization that in national parks all over the country, there are people who go missing in the most extraordinary situations. There's a group of people on a trail together, 6 or 7 in a row, and there's one at the back, and they look around and the person is gone. It's never found again. Or is found in impossible locations. Like you get a 2-year-old child who's missing for 3 months. He's with the grandparents. The grandparents look back, they look back again, and the child is gone. And there's this huge searches, air searches, aerial searches, helicopters, sniffer dogs, whatever, and the child isn't found. And then a month later, they find the child 70 miles away on top of a mountain in his bare feet, no clothes on him, you know, and he has no idea what happened to him in the interim. or people who go missing and they're never found again. So there's a guy called David Paulides who studied this in great depth, and he calls it missing 411. And so a lot of this happens in national parks. And so one of the theories is that either extraterrestrials are abducting people to study them scientifically, and either they never come back, or they come back and they have no memory where they've been. And is there some kind of collusion between the governments of the world and these off kind of planetary entities? So that's the mystery right out there. But the phenomenon is totally real. It's an area I've been fascinated by for many, many years. And so I've listened to many of David Paulides' accounts of people who've gone missing. And there seems to be kind of, I don't want to kind of frighten any Germans here this morning, but there's a huge preponderance of people who go missing in American parks who are of German origin, you know, and either people who are very, very intelligent or people who are kind of handicapped in some way, as if some kind of intelligence is trying to study the kind of the spectrum of human abilities and what causes, for instance, Down syndrome, or what gives a person a genius IQ, and that they've been abducted in order to study them, and that often they're never heard of again, like they've been sucked through a portal, or else they're sucked through a portal, and then months later they're deposited in an area, and often they're wearing somebody else's clothes, or they're found in locations that have been previously searched ad nauseum, even using sniffer dogs, and there's been no trail. And now suddenly, 3 weeks later, they come to the same place that they've kind of searched 40 times in the last 3 weeks, and suddenly there's a 2-year-old child sitting there in his bare feet wearing somebody else's clothes. So that's the phenomenon to which you're referring. So what's going on? What's going on, obviously, is that we live in a universe which is much more complex than we give it credit for. And by shrinking our mindset down to, you know, we're the only planet with life, you know, and materialistic science is going to give us all the answers, that's an impoverished version. And so to answer your question more directly, yes, I believe that it is possible that, you know, we're being experimented upon. You know, that warfare itself is an experiment to generate the kind of energy that feeds kind of sick extraterrestrial or extra-dimensional entities. So the universe in which we live is a much more complicated place than we give it credit for. Okay. Brilliant question, Marie. So Marie, for those of you who don't know her, she's a professor of neurology, optics particularly is your forte, the neurology of the optical system. And Marie is also a vintner. She has a vineyard up in Winters. And so what she's saying is that in her background as a scientist, that often she's wrestling with concepts which she can't kind of articulate or fully understand with her left brain activity as a scientist. And then as a farmer, she's dealing with people who are uneducated, but who have this extraordinary telepathic ability and can read their jobs and read their kind of their terrain and their vineyards in a way in which she can't. And so using those two pieces together, is there some way that we can develop a Christ consciousness which somehow transcends both left brain and right brain activity? And I would say yes, that is the next stage of human development. You know, what I've called sometimes homo mysticus or homo Christus, that we're elevating, you know, beyond merely the physical brain. The problem with the physical brain is that it's a reducing mechanism. We tend to think of the brain as the origin of consciousness. It is not. It's a consciousness reducer. And so there's actually an area at the back of the brain called the reticular activating system, the RAS, which actually censors material coming in so as not to overload the brain with data, because we're constantly being bombarded with data. So when, for instance, I said to you, take 5 seconds out and look around the room, and all of the data you're taking in, how much of that actually reached your prefrontal cortex so that you could articulate almost less than 1% of it, you know, that you could articulate. And so this RAS back here is actually censoring. It's like you've got the CEO up here and you've got the secretary at the back, and the secretary is censoring information coming in because the secretary doesn't want to overload the CEO with unnecessary data. And so that's the problem we have, that our brains are not generating consciousness, they're reducing consciousness. And so one of the prayers I make regularly is that I want to kind of, I want to develop a Christ consciousness so that my range of abilities are extended, and so that, you know, that I can transcend the physical brain itself. And so I want Christ consciousness instead of just intelligence. You know, I want spiritual experience instead of just mathematical know-how. And so I think learning how to transcend into different states of consciousness is the key to it. And obviously then there are the techniques. What do you do to make that happen? Part of it is meditation. Part of it is spending time with little children. Part of it is being out in nature in your vineyard, watching what nature does. You know, as the leaves are coming on the vines at this stage, you're watching what that is doing. For some people, it's entheogens. That hasn't been my way, but there are people who will use plant medicine, ayahuasca or peyote or psilocybin or mushrooms or whatever. And for some people, that's a really powerful mechanism. Now, the difference for me between those methods and other methods is the example I've used sometimes is I live near Mount Kilimanjaro in Kenya, which is it straddles the boundary between Kenya and Tanzania, and it's 17,000 feet high. And to trek up and down Mount Kilimanjaro is a 5-day safari. It takes about 3 days up and 2 days down. So the view from the top, obviously I've never been to the top of it, is phenomenal. Now, suppose you could create a cable car that would connect the ground to the top of Mount Kilimanjaro. And now you can get up to the top in 30 minutes. And you can see this extraordinary vista. And it's mind-boggling. You spend half an hour up there, then you come back down, you're telling people about it. Or you decide to join a group, a safari, and it's going to take you 5 days to go up and come back down. And so you're sleeping out, you're in a tent, it's freezing cold, you're being bitten by mosquitoes, you're creating fires, you're sitting on the fires with your group, you're telling stories, you're cooking your own food, and then you get to the top and you get the same view that the people from the cable car got. And then you got 2 more days coming down, camping with people, cooking your own food, being bitten by mosquitoes, sharing stories. You came to the bottom of the mountain. You've seen the same view from the top, but you're totally different people. Because there's a huge difference between altered states and altered traits. So there are some methods that can give you an altered state, but it's not going to change you. You're going to be, wow, that was great, but you do nothing with it. And so you have all these great experiences, but they don't translate into instead of just states of consciousness, you need stages of consciousness. Instead of states of consciousness, you need traits of consciousness. That our job is to develop Christ consciousness, not just get these kind of voyeuristic experiences, that we didn't earn, and we're going to forget really, really quickly and not grow because of. And so we have to be really careful that, and I'm not saying that plant medicine can't do that for somebody. Obviously, if you're working with a shaman who knows their stuff, and you're with a group that is dedicated. So my understanding of any kind of plant medicine is that they're called the 4 S's. I think that it's called the substance, the setting, the mindset, and the sitter. And so the substance is it ayahuasca, is it peyote, is it mescaline, whatever it is, that's the substance. The setting is what kind of environment. Are you at a rave, with rock and roll music? Is that what you're experiencing it? So that's the kind of the setting. The set is the mindset. Why am I doing this? Is this to get a thrill, or is this to progress, spiritually? And then fourthly, the sitter. Are you with somebody who knows the terrain, like a shaman, who can guide you through these experiences? Are you out on your own without a map? And so it becomes really important then, what are the modalities we employ in order to experience these different states of consciousness, and make sure that the states of consciousness translate into stages of consciousness, into traits of consciousness, that we don't just stop with the experiences, but that we develop as people as well.